Daniel had always cherished the quiet of stormy nights in his cabin, isolated deep in the woods. Tonight was one of those nights. Outside, thunder rumbled in waves, the rain drumming against the roof in steady, powerful sheets. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. His cabin was wrapped in darkness, save for the soft glow of a single lantern, casting a warm, flickering light over the rustic room. Daniel was settling into his favorite armchair, a thick blanket over his lap and a steaming mug of tea in hand, ready to escape into the pages of a book. The storm outside was fierce, but inside, all was peaceful and calm, a perfect night for solitude. But just as he was about to lose himself in his book, Daniel heard a faint sound, so quiet he thought he might have imagined it. He froze, listening carefully as the sound repeated, barely audible beneath the rain and wind. It was a soft, desperate whimper, muffled by the storm but unmistakable. It tugged at his heart instantly, pulling him out of his cozy bubble. Daniel set his book and tea aside, his senses sharpening as he tuned into the unusual sound. "What on earth?" he muttered, sitting up straight, straining to listen. The whimpering continued, growing slightly louder, and he realized it was coming from right outside his door. His pulse quickened with curiosity and concern. No creature deserved to be out in weather like this, especially something as vulnerable sounding as what he was hearing. He pushed the blanket aside and crossed the room, his bare feet padding quietly on the wooden floor. As he reached for the door handle, he felt a mix of anticipation and dread, wondering what he'd find on the other side. Opening the door, Daniel was met with a rush of cold wind and rain, the stormy night air cutting straight through him. He squinted, peering into the darkness, and there on his front porch, huddled against the doorframe, was a tiny, shivering creature. It was so small he almost missed it, just a drenched ball of fur barely visible in the dim light. But as soon as he saw it, Daniel's heart twisted with compassion. The creature looked up at him, its wide, glistening eyes catching the light from the cabin and reflecting it back with an intensity that surprised him. Its gaze held a pleading, almost intelligent look, like it was begging him for help. Daniel knelt slowly, reaching out his hand. "Hey there, little one," he murmured, keeping his voice soft and soothing. "Where did you come from?" The creature flinched, its small body tense with fear, but it didn't run. Instead, it let out another faint whimper, pressing itself further into the corner of the porch, as if torn between fear and the desperate need for shelter. Daniel's heart melted at the sight. He stretched his hand closer, allowing the creature to sniff his fingers, and after a few tense moments, it seemed to relax slightly, inching forward as though testing his intentions. "Good boy, or girl," Daniel chuckled softly, realizing he had no idea what he was dealing with. Slowly, carefully, he slipped his hands under its soaked belly, lifting it up into his arms. It was even smaller than he'd expected, barely weighing anything at all. The creature burrowed into his chest, as if seeking every bit of warmth it could find, its fur damp and clinging to his shirt. As he carried it inside, Daniel's mind raced. Where had this little one come from? The nearest town was miles away, and he couldn't imagine how something so small had ended up on his doorstep, especially in the middle of a storm. He closed the door, shutting out the cold, and quickly wrapped the creature in a soft, dry towel, gently rubbing it to warm it up. Now that he had it in the light, Daniel took a closer look. It was mostly black, with patches of white on its paws and a streak of gray along its back. But what struck him most were its eyes, large, round, and dark, with an intensity that seemed almost unnatural for a puppy. They flicked over his face, steadying him with a focus that gave him pause. Daniel shook his head, smiling. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" he murmured, wrapping the towel a bit tighter around it. The creature gave a soft whine, almost as if it were answering him, and nestled deeper into his arms. Daniel carried it over to the couch, sitting down and cradling it close as he felt it start to relax, its tiny body finally releasing some of its tension. Over the next hour, he kept the puppy close, whispering soothing words as he gently stroked its fur. It felt strange to him somehow, thicker and softer than any dog fur he'd ever felt. The little one seemed content to just sit there, watching him with those intense eyes, never once barking or whining like other dogs might. The quiet, almost meditative way it observed him unsettled Daniel slightly, but he brushed the thought aside. It had probably been through a lot. He'd likely be in shock too if he'd been lost out in a storm like that. As the creature dried off and warmed up, its shivering stopped, and it slowly drifted into sleep, its breathing deep and even. Daniel felt a surprising sense of peace wash over him. He hadn't planned on adopting a pet, but something about this little creature already felt like it belonged with him. He'd keep it safe, he decided, and if someone came looking, he'd be sure to find it a proper home. But as he sat there, watching it sleep, his mind began to wander back to its strange, intense gaze, the way it seemed to study him as if it understood him. He couldn't quite shake the feeling that there was something unusual about this little one. Dogs didn't usually look at people like that, didn't carry such a sharp awareness in their eyes. "Maybe you're just special," he whispered, giving it a gentle scratch behind the ears. The creature let out a soft, almost purring sound in response, which struck Daniel as odd. But he brushed the thought aside, content to sit there with his new companion as the storm raged on outside. Eventually, as the night grew late, Daniel carefully moved the creature to a cozy makeshift bed near the fireplace, laying it down gently. It stirred slightly, but didn't wake, curling up into a tight ball and settling back into sleep. He watched it for a moment, feeling a strange sense of protectiveness. He still didn't know what had brought it to his doorstep, or why it seemed so different, but one thing was certain, he wasn't going to let it go. Daniel's days began to shift in small, unexpected ways after bringing Shadow home. From the very start, he noticed odd behaviors in the little creature that didn't seem quite like a regular puppy. For one, Shadow didn't bark, not even once. While most puppies had an endless supply of yips, barks, and whimpers, Shadow only made strange little chirps and sometimes a low, almost musical hum. It was a sound Daniel had never heard from any dog. One chilly morning, Daniel made breakfast, the smell of eggs and toast filling his cozy cabin. Shadow sat nearby, tilting its head with an intense focus, as if carefully studying each move. "You sure do watch me a lot, huh?" Daniel chuckled, amused at his puppy's curiosity. Yet, as he looked back at Shadow, he couldn't help but notice the way those large, amber eyes seemed to follow his every move with an unnervingly sharp awareness. It wasn't just the lack of barking or the silent observation that set Shadow apart. Unlike most puppies that wag their tails in delight at the simplest things, a friendly scratch behind the ears, a treat, or a playful game, Shadow was oddly still. Its tail, long and thick, didn't wag much, only moving in slow, calculated swishes, almost like a cat. And instead of bounding after toys or chasing balls, Shadow would simply sit, watching them roll by with a kind of quiet disinterest. One afternoon, Daniel decided to take Shadow out to the local park to see if it might spark some more typical doggy behavior. As they walked along the trail, Daniel noticed that, while other dogs bounded up eagerly to greet their owners and sniff around, Shadow kept its distance from people and dogs alike. When a particularly friendly golden retriever trotted over, tail wagging and eyes bright, Shadow simply watched, head tilted and fur slightly raised, as if deciding whether to engage. "Come on, Shadow," Daniel urged, kneeling down and trying to get his pet's attention. But Shadow just gave him a slow blink, like it was in no hurry to meet anyone. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Other pet owners gave Daniel curious looks. One woman approached, looking Shadow up and down with a puzzled expression. "What breed is that?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Daniel shrugged, still unsure himself. "Not sure," he replied. "I found him abandoned. He's unique." The woman nodded, but he could tell she was puzzled. Shadow had a quality about it that didn't quite fit the typical image of a puppy. Its fur, thick and soft, had a pattern that almost seemed wild, streaked with patches of darker shades that reminded him of something he might see in a forest or a mountain landscape. The mystery continued to grow, along with Shadow's peculiar behavior. When they returned home that evening, Shadow lay near the window, watching the forest intently as if listening to sounds Daniel couldn't hear. It was something he'd noticed it doing a lot. Shadow seemed almost connected to nature in a way that went beyond what Daniel had seen in other animals. It was like it had an awareness of the outdoors that Daniel couldn't understand. As days turned into weeks, Shadow's quiet, watchful presence became part of Daniel's life. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something about Shadow was unusual. One day, he decided to test a theory that had been lingering in his mind. Most puppies he knew would follow a trail of treats anywhere, eagerly sniffing around until they found every last crumb. But when Daniel laid out a line of treats across the floor, Shadow simply looked at them, nose twitching as if it recognized the scent but held no interest in following it. Puzzled, Daniel picked up one of the treats and held it to Shadow's nose. "Go on," he coaxed, expecting Shadow to take the treat. But instead, it simply turned its head away, as if saying, "No, thank you." What kind of puppy doesn't go crazy for treats? Daniel muttered, scratching his head. Shadow simply gave him a look, its eyes intelligent and almost amused, as though it understood far more than it was letting on. Daniel was beginning to wonder if Shadow might not be a puppy at all. But if not a dog, then what was it? One evening, as he settled in to watch a nature documentary, Shadow lay by his feet, its head resting on its paws. The documentary featured wolves, and as the images of the wild animals played across the screen, Daniel noticed Shadow's ears perk up. It watched the screen with an intensity that surprised him, its amber eyes glued to the wolves as they moved silently through the snowy landscape. At one point, a wolf let out a low, haunting howl, and Shadow lifted its head, eyes alert, listening intently. Daniel sat up, heart pounding slightly as he observed Shadow's reaction. He couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was stirring inside his puppy. As the wolf on the screen continued to howl, Shadow let out a soft whine, its gaze distant, almost as if it were remembering something. Daniel's chest tightened, and he turned off the TV, silence filling the room once more. Later that night, as Daniel lay in bed, he heard Shadow moving around near the window. It was quiet, just the soft patting of paws, but then came a sound he hadn't expected, a low, haunting sound, almost like a howl, barely audible yet enough to make the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He sat up in bed, listening as Shadow repeated the sound, its head tilted up toward the night sky. "Shadow?" Daniel called out softly, more curious than frightened. Shadow stopped and looked back at him, its eyes reflecting the moonlight streaming through the window. There was something wild, something untamed in that gaze. Daniel felt a strange mix of awe and unease. What had he brought into his home? The next morning, determined to get answers, Daniel began researching animal behavior and wolf hybrids, trying to find any clue that might explain Shadow's odd behaviors. He combed through books, articles, and forums, each new piece of information deepening the mystery. Everything he read about wolf hybrids suggested behaviors similar to Shadow's, but even so, there were details that didn't add up. Shadow was different, stranger. Daniel began to wonder if Shadow had come from a different lineage entirely. He remembered the intensity of those amber eyes, the grace of its movements, and the almost otherworldly silence it maintained, and felt a shiver run down his spine. This was not a typical animal, and he was beginning to think that bringing it home was the start of something much bigger. One evening, as he sat in his living room with Shadow curled at his feet, he spoke aloud, almost as if talking to himself. "What are you, really?" he asked, half expecting no response. But Shadow lifted its head, meeting his gaze with an expression so piercing, so intelligent, that Daniel felt a chill. Days turned into weeks, and Shadow continued to grow, its body maturing into something neither fully dog nor wolf. It moved with a quiet strength and an intense awareness, a presence that made Daniel's curiosity deepen even further. Each day, Shadow revealed a little more of itself, but never enough to give Daniel a complete answer. One day, as he watched Shadow from across the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the brink of a discovery, one that would change everything he thought he knew about the creature he had taken in. Over the next few months, Daniel was both captivated and perplexed by the changes he saw in Shadow. The little creature he had found shivering on his porch had grown swiftly, transforming before his very eyes. Each morning, it seemed larger, its limbs stretching longer and its coat thickening, showing patterns of streaks and colors that didn't resemble any dog breed he was familiar with. The puppy's paws, so tiny at first, had become broad and powerful, and Daniel could hardly keep up with the amount of food Shadow seemed to devour. Neighbors began to notice Shadow's unique appearance and behavior. "What kind of breed is he?" an elderly neighbor asked one day, eyeing Shadow with a mixture of awe and curiosity as he walked by. Daniel hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "Honestly, I'm not really sure," he admitted with a small chuckle, scratching the back of his head. "I found him as a stray and thought he was just a lost puppy." The neighbor gave him a puzzled look but nodded with a smile, likely assuming he was caring for some rare breed. But it wasn't just the appearance that was unusual. Shadow's mannerisms became even more curious as the weeks went by. Shadow didn't bark like the dogs Daniel had grown up with. In fact, he never barked at all. Instead, he would make soft, almost chirping sounds, a noise that was more like a bird or, strangely, like a small wild animal. The first time Daniel heard it, he'd laughed, thinking it was an odd quirk. But as time passed, the sound became eerier, especially when Shadow would let out that soft chirp while staring into the woods. His ears perked and his eyes narrowed in intense focus. There was something else Daniel couldn't ignore. Shadow seemed more intelligent than a typical dog. He could swear that Shadow watched him with an understanding beyond that of any pet he'd known. One evening, while he was cooking in the kitchen, he noticed Shadow watching him with such keen focus that he almost felt uncomfortable. It was as if Shadow was studying him, watching his every movement as he chopped vegetables and stirred the pot. When Daniel looked up, meeting those deep, penetrating eyes, he felt a chill run down his spine. "You're a strange one, aren't you?" he murmured, half-jokingly, giving Shadow a scratch behind the ears. Shadow tilted his head, staring back at him with an expression that seemed almost human. As Shadow continued to grow, Daniel realized he could no longer lift him as he used to. By the time winter settled in, Shadow was larger than most dogs in the neighborhood, his frame sleek yet muscular, his movements graceful and precise. The young puppy he had found in distress had transformed into a powerful, striking creature, and Daniel couldn't help but marvel at him every time they went for a walk. People would stop and stare, intrigued by Shadow's unusual build and the confident way he moved. Some would even ask to pet him, though Daniel often found himself hesitating, unsure of how Shadow might react. One day, a man with a dog of his own stopped Daniel on the trail, gesturing toward Shadow with an admiring glance. "He's magnificent." "What breed did you say he was?" the man asked, leaning down as if to get a closer look. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again, unsure of what to say. I'm not exactly sure," he admitted finally. "I found him as a stray, so it's a bit of a mystery." The man chuckled, patting his own dog. "Well, whatever he is, he's something special. Look at those eyes." Daniel smiled, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking at something more than just a dog. At night, Shadow's behavior took on an even stranger edge. While most dogs would curl up on a warm blanket or at the foot of the bed, Shadow preferred to sit by the window, staring out into the darkness as if searching for something. Daniel would often wake up in the middle of the night to find Shadow standing perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the forest beyond the backyard. The sight was eerie, almost haunting, as Shadow seemed more in his element under the moonlight than inside a cozy home. Daniel began to wonder if there was something about the wilderness that called to Shadow, something that he couldn't quite understand. One evening, as Daniel sat by the fireplace, he noticed Shadow moving with unusual stealth across the living room. The way Shadow placed his paws on the ground, silent and precise, reminded him less of a dog and more of a predator on the hunt. The thought made him shiver. Shadow's movements were graceful, almost feline, and as he watched, Daniel found himself captivated by the creature he had brought into his home. Shadow glanced back at him, and in the flickering light of the fire, his eyes glowed with an intensity that was both beautiful and unsettling. The most unnerving moment came one night when Daniel was watching television. He glanced over and saw Shadow staring at him, unblinking. It wasn't the usual look of affection that pets often gave their owners, it was a look of curiosity, as though Shadow were studying him. A chill crept up Daniel's spine as he wondered, not for the first time, what he had brought into his home. Daniel's concern grew with each passing day as Shadow's behavior became more unusual, far from what he'd expect of a dog. Each hike in the woods seemed to pull some hidden instinct from within Shadow, a calling that Daniel couldn't quite understand. Shadow, the small, shivering puppy he had rescued, was now almost unrecognizable, transforming from a timid creature to something powerful, swift, and hauntingly aware. Daniel had begun taking Shadow on hikes more frequently, hoping the fresh air and exercise would settle its strange energy. But instead, Shadow seemed to become even more attuned to its surroundings, its gaze sharp, almost predatory. On one particular morning, the air was crisp, and fallen leaves crunched underfoot. Daniel and Shadow had reached the edge of a familiar trail, one where they often walked in silence, Daniel usually a few steps ahead while Shadow explored on its leash. Today, though, he sensed that Shadow needed more freedom. "All right, Shadow," he murmured, unclipping the leash. "Go stretch out a bit, but don't go too far." Shadow's ears perked, its eyes gleaming with something close to understanding. Daniel watched as it stood still for a moment, studying him with an unsettling intensity before it bolted into the trees with astonishing speed. Daniel's eyes widened as he watched Shadow move through the forest, weaving through trees, ducking under branches, and slipping through the underbrush with a fluidity he'd never seen in a dog before. The small creature he had taken in was now quick and agile, almost like a shadow itself, blending seamlessly into the forest. He chuckled nervously, half amused, half worried, and called after it. "Don't go too far, Shadow. You know I can't keep up with you." Minutes ticked by, and Daniel realized that Shadow had yet to return. He scanned the trees, listening carefully for the sound of paws crunching through leaves or a bark in the distance. Instead, the forest was silent. Too silent. The usual rustling of birds or squirrels had vanished, and a thick, almost eerie stillness hung in the air. Daniel's heartbeat quickened, and he called out, "Shadow." His voice echoed into the woods, but no familiar response came. Just as he was about to venture further into the woods to search, a rustling sound came from a nearby bush. Daniel's head snapped toward it, relief flooding him as Shadow emerged from the shadows, its sleek form moving gracefully through the trees. But as Shadow stepped closer, Daniel noticed something odd. Its gait was slower, almost cautious, and there was a dark stain around its mouth. In its jaws, clamped firmly, was a small animal, a rabbit, its body limp, eyes glazed over. Daniel's stomach tightened, a chill creeping up his spine. He hadn't taught Shadow to hunt, and he certainly hadn't expected this. Shadow patted over, the rabbit dangling from its jaws, and dropped the animal at Daniel's feet, looking up at him with a peculiar, almost triumphant gleam in its eyes. Daniel knelt down, staring at the rabbit, unable to mask his shock. "Shadow, where did you learn this?" he whispered, more to himself than to the creature. The little puppy he had found trembling on his doorstep months ago was now something completely different. Shadow tilted its head, watching Daniel with an unblinking gaze, and for a moment, Daniel felt like prey under its scrutiny. Shadow let out a low, guttural sound, something halfway between a growl and a purr, and Daniel shivered. The sound was neither dog-like nor cat-like, it was something entirely its own, something Daniel couldn't place but instinctively feared. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and brushed his fingers along Shadow's fur. It felt rougher, wilder than he remembered, almost as if the creature were shedding its domesticated appearance for something raw and untamed. As he looked closer, he noticed that Shadow's fur had developed an odd, streaked pattern, dark stripes that ran down its back and around its legs. The texture was coarser, almost like the coat of a wild animal, and its limbs were longer, leaner than those of any dog he had known. Shadow's gaze never wavered, its intense amber eyes locking onto Daniel's. They were no longer the warm brown of a typical dog's eyes, these were sharper, focused, filled with an intelligence that unsettled him. There was something ancient, something almost predatory in those eyes, a wisdom that seemed out of place in the body of a creature he had thought was a simple stray. Daniel's heart thudded as he tried to reconcile the image of the fragile puppy he'd taken in with the creature standing before him now. "Shadow," he murmured, forcing a shaky smile, "you're full of surprises, aren't you?" Shadow gave a low, rumbling response, and Daniel chuckled, though the sound came out strained. He tried to tell himself that Shadow was still the animal he had cared for, the creature he had bonded with over these past months. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Shadow than he could understand. On the hike back home, Daniel kept Shadow on a tighter leash, his mind racing with questions he didn't know how to answer. Every so often, he glanced down at Shadow, watching the way it moved, the way it scanned its surroundings with a keen focus, as if aware of every shift in the wind, every rustle in the grass. The creature beside him was both familiar and foreign, a paradox wrapped in fur and muscle. Once they reached the cabin, Shadow settled by the door, curling up with an alertness Daniel hadn't noticed before. It didn't relax fully, its eyes remained half open, its ears twitching at every sound. Daniel watched it from across the room, a sense of unease settling in his chest. It was as though Shadow was guarding something, not only the cabin but a secret hidden within itself, one that it wasn't ready to reveal. That night, Daniel lay awake, his thoughts looping back to Shadow's behavior on the trail, the rabbit it had brought him, the way it had watched him with that unnerving intensity. Questions filled his mind. What kind of creature was Shadow, really? Had he misinterpreted everything from the start? Was Shadow, as the vet had hinted in passing, truly a dog at all? As he lay there, staring into the darkness, a soft scratching noise pulled him from his thoughts. He sat up, listening, his heart pounding as the sound continued. It was coming from the door. Slowly, he climbed out of bed and crept toward the noise, his pulse quickening. When he opened the door, Shadow was sitting on the porch, staring out into the darkness, its ears perked, its muscles tense. Daniel stepped outside, feeling the cold night air on his skin as he watched Shadow. The creature seemed transfixed, staring into the forest with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. He followed its gaze, straining to see what had captured its attention, but all he could make out were shadows among the trees. "Shadow, what is it?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. But Shadow didn't respond. Instead, it let out that strange, half-growl, half-purr sound again, the one that didn't belong to any dog he knew. It was a sound that seemed to speak of something deeper, something wild and ancient that he was only beginning to understand. As he stood there in the moonlight, Daniel realized that whatever Shadow truly was, it wasn't just a pet, and it certainly wasn't the creature he had assumed. There was a mystery woven into its being, a history that went beyond the life they had shared together. Slowly, he placed a hand on Shadow's head, feeling its heartbeat steady and strong beneath his palm. In that moment, he understood that he couldn't change what Shadow was, nor did he want to. He would follow this journey wherever it led, even if it took him into unknown territory, even if it meant embracing a creature that was part mystery, part companion, and entirely its own. Daniel's worry had grown to the point that he could no longer ignore it, so he decided to visit the local vet, hoping she could shed some light on what Shadow really was. The drive was quiet, with Shadow sitting calmly in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the scenery rushing by. Daniel stole a glance at him every so often, noting how Shadow's features seemed even more intense now, his eyes sharp, his body lithe and powerful. Daniel had long since come to realize that this puppy was far from ordinary. Arriving at the vet's office, Daniel led Shadow inside, feeling the weight of curious glances from other pet owners in the waiting area. Most people watched Shadow with wide eyes, clearly fascinated, and perhaps a little wary, of his unusual appearance. Shadow, unfazed by the attention, sat obediently beside Daniel, but his gaze never stayed in one place for long. He seemed to take in every sight and sound with a vigilance that Daniel couldn't quite put into words. It was as if Shadow were constantly aware of the slightest movement, his instincts finely tuned to detect any threat. When it was finally their turn, the vet, Dr. Keller, greeted them with a friendly smile, though her expression quickly shifted to one of intrigue as she looked at Shadow. Well, who do we have here?" she murmured, crouching down to examine Shadow closely. As she moved around him, her eyebrows furrowed, and a hint of confusion crossed her face. He certainly has a unique look, she remarked, her voice trailing off as she examined his coat and his eyes, which met hers with an unsettling steadiness. Dr. Keller stood up, motioning for them to follow her into the examination room. Daniel led Shadow in, trying to suppress the growing anxiety in his chest. He had no idea what to expect, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. As Dr. Keller began her examination, she noted things aloud to herself, her tone shifting from curiosity to something bordering on astonishment. His teeth, these are not typical for a dog, she murmured, gently lifting Shadow's lip to reveal sharp, pointed canines that seemed longer than normal. She checked his paws next, her fingers brushing over the pads. And these claws, they're almost retractable, like a wild animal's. Daniel's heart raced. What does that mean? He asked, his voice laced with a mix of fear and fascination. Dr. Keller glanced at him, her expression serious. I've never seen anything quite like this. I'll be honest, Daniel, I don't think Shadow is a dog. At least, not entirely. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Daniel's mind raced, struggling to process the revelation. Not a dog, he echoed, feeling the reality of her words sink in. Dr. Keller nodded slowly. I'm going to run a few tests, but my guess is that he's a wolf hybrid, or possibly something even more unusual. She hesitated, as if choosing her next words carefully. But whatever he is, there's something undeniably wild about him. Animals like this don't always adapt well to domestic life, Daniel. They have instincts that can be difficult to control. Daniel felt a pang of unease. He had grown attached to Shadow in ways he hadn't expected, and the thought of him being anything other than a loyal companion was hard to accept. He's never shown any aggression, he defended softly, looking down at Shadow, who was now watching him with those piercing eyes. He's different, yes. But he's gentle with me. Dr. Keller placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression sympathetic. I'm sure he is, Daniel. But animals like Shadow aren't always predictable. They can be influenced by instincts that are hardwired into their nature. She let her words sink in, studying Daniel's face. I need you to be prepared for the possibility that Shadow may never fully adapt to a domesticated life. It's not about his loyalty or how much he cares for you, it's about his nature. Daniel's mind spun as he tried to reconcile the creature he had cared for all these months with the reality Dr. Keller was presenting. Shadow, his loyal friend, the puppy he had rescued, wasn't just a dog. He might be a creature with a wild heart, a heart that didn't belong in a quiet home or a fenced yard. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Dr. Keller stood back, wiping her hands before giving Shadow a thoughtful look. Let me take him for some blood work and a few additional tests. I want to make sure we're clear on exactly what Shadow is. Daniel nodded, his stomach churning as he handed Shadow's leash to her. Shadow glanced back at him, his gaze calm but somehow knowing, as if he understood more about the situation than anyone could guess. Minutes ticked by as Daniel waited alone in the examination room, his mind running through every memory he had of Shadow. The strange sounds he made, the way he moved with an elegance that seemed almost unnatural, the hunting instinct that had become more pronounced as he grew older. Each memory took on a new meaning, pieces of a puzzle that was only now becoming clear. When Dr. Keller returned, her face was lined with concern. Daniel, she began, her tone cautious, Shadow's tests confirmed my suspicions. He is, indeed, a wolf hybrid. And there's evidence to suggest that he may have traits of an even more elusive species, possibly a rare wild canid that isn't normally found around here. Daniel felt his throat tighten. The confirmation, while not entirely surprising, hit him harder than he expected. So, what does that mean? He asked, barely able to get the words out. Dr. Keller took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. It means Shadow's instincts may be even stronger than that of a typical wolf hybrid. He's likely drawn to open spaces, to the hunt, to the kinds of behaviors that don't align with living in a human household. She looked at him sympathetically, sensing his attachment to Shadow. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. But animals like Shadow are happiest and healthiest when they have room to roam, to express those instincts. Keeping him confined could be harmful for both of you. Daniel nodded slowly, his heart aching. He thought about the time he'd spent with Shadow, the bond they'd formed. Letting go seemed impossible, yet he knew in his heart that Dr. Keller was right. So, you're saying I need to let him go? Dr. Keller nodded. If you want what's best for him, yes. There are sanctuaries that could take him in, places where he could live freely, surrounded by professionals who understand his needs. Daniel swallowed, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Shadow had been more than just a pet, he had been a companion, a presence that had filled his days with warmth and purpose. But now, he realized that keeping Shadow would mean denying him the life he was meant to live. Dr. Keller's hand rested on his shoulder again. This isn't an easy choice, Daniel. But it's one that reflects true love for Shadow, giving him the freedom he deserves, even if it's hard for you. Daniel looked over at Shadow, who was sitting quietly, watching him with those intense, almost mystical eyes. He felt a pang of sadness, but he also knew what he had to do. Taking a deep breath, he knelt down beside Shadow, running his fingers through the thick fur that had once been so small and soft. "You're not mine to keep," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "But you'll always be part of me." Shadow tilted his head, leaning into Daniel's touch, as if sensing the emotion in the air. For a moment, they stayed like that, two souls connected by an unlikely bond. And in that moment, Daniel knew that letting Shadow go was not an end, but a continuation of the journey they had started together. Daniel knelt by Shadow's side, his fingers gently combing through the creature's thick, wild fur. He could feel the silent weight of the decision resting heavily on him, and though Shadow couldn't understand his words, it was as if he sensed the shift. Shadow's head leaned against Daniel's shoulder, the warmth of their bond wrapping around them both in a bittersweet embrace. As the reality of letting go settled in, Daniel's mind wandered back to the beginning, to that rainy night on his doorstep when Shadow had arrived, scared and fragile. How different things had been back then, when Daniel had believed he'd simply rescued an abandoned puppy. He had watched Shadow grow, learning his habits and quirks, never questioning that this unique animal was anything other than his pet. But now, with Dr. Keller's revelation, he understood that he had only been a part of Shadow's journey, never its end. Standing up, Daniel gave Dr. Keller a grateful nod. She could see the heartbreak in his eyes and offered him a small, understanding smile. "You're doing the right thing, Daniel. And Shadow's time with you has clearly been meaningful. He's ready for the next chapter of his life, just as much as you are." Her words gave him some comfort, even if they didn't fully ease the ache in his heart. It took strength he hadn't known he had, but Daniel finally accepted that loving Shadow meant giving him the freedom to be what he was meant to be. Dr. Keller had mentioned a wildlife sanctuary nearby, a safe haven where animals like Shadow could live freely without the constraints of human life. It would be a place where Shadow could finally fulfill his instincts, unhindered by the limitations of a domestic life. That evening, Daniel prepared for their last trip together, packing Shadow's belongings, the toys he never quite knew how to play with, the blanket he slept on beside Daniel's bed. Each item felt heavy with memories. He tucked them gently into a box, pausing to run his fingers over each one, remembering the countless small moments they had shared. The next morning, Daniel loaded Shadow into the car, his heart tight with anticipation and sadness. Shadow, ever observant, watched him quietly from the passenger seat, as if sensing the significance of the journey ahead. The drive was long and silent, the early morning mist hanging thick over the road as Daniel navigated toward the sanctuary. He kept his hand on Shadow's back, grounding himself in the warmth and presence of the creature who had come to mean so much to him. As they reached the sanctuary, Daniel's emotions felt both overwhelming and strangely peaceful. The sanctuary staff greeted him warmly, explaining the layout and the areas where animals like Shadow could live freely, in environments closely resembling their natural habitats. Listening to them, Daniel felt a small measure of relief. He was reassured that Shadow would be well cared for, able to roam vast, open areas, surrounded by others who understood and respected his nature. Finally, it was time. Daniel led Shadow to the enclosure, his steps slow and measured, his hand never leaving Shadow's fur. The sanctuary staff opened the gate, offering Daniel one last moment to say goodbye. He knelt down, looking into Shadow's intelligent eyes, seeing in them a blend of wildness and loyalty. "Thank you, Shadow," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Thank you for being with me, for teaching me what it means to truly care for something free and wild. You'll always have a place in my heart." Shadow's eyes held his gaze for a moment, and then, as if understanding, he turned and walked through the gate. Daniel watched him go, his heart aching but full, seeing Shadow's form disappear into the vast, open space where he would finally belong. And though Shadow never looked back, Daniel knew that a part of him would always remember their time together. As he walked back to his car, Daniel felt the weight of grief, but also a newfound respect for what it meant to love and let go. Shadow had come into his life unexpectedly, leaving a mark that would never fade. And as he drove away from the sanctuary, Daniel knew he had done the right thing, not just for Shadow, but for himself. The road stretched ahead, open and quiet, as he made his way home, carrying the memory of Shadow with him, a reminder of the beauty of wild things and the profound impact of a bond that had changed him forever. Hours later, the vet returned, her expression serious and hesitant, as if struggling to put her thoughts into words. Daniel sat up straighter, his heart pounding with a mix of dread and anticipation. Shadow sat quietly beside him, watching the vet with an unblinking, intense gaze, almost as if sensing the gravity of the moment. "Daniel," the vet began slowly, choosing her words carefully. "Shadow is not a dog." The statement hung in the air, heavy and bewildering. Daniel blinked, feeling a wave of confusion. "Not a dog," he repeated, struggling to make sense of her words. He glanced down at Shadow, who sat there innocently, his unusual eyes glinting under the clinic's fluorescent lights. The vet took a deep breath, leaning in as she explained. "From what I've observed and from the initial tests I ran, Shadow's DNA is highly unusual. There's evidence of wolf genetics, yes, but there's something else, something that doesn't match any of the standard profiles for domestic or even wild canine species. Whatever Shadow is, he's not like anything I've encountered before." Daniel's mind reeled. A wolf hybrid was one thing, but the idea that Shadow was something else entirely was unsettling. He looked at the vet, searching for reassurance. "What do you mean? If he's not a dog, what exactly is he?" The vet hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with her lack of concrete answers. "I'm not entirely sure. It's as if his DNA contains traces of another animal family, something that's closer to wild than domesticated. There are patterns in his genetics that suggest something ancient, something that might be more primal." Daniel felt a shiver run down his spine. Shadow, sensing his discomfort, inched closer, pressing his head against Daniel's leg in a rare display of affection. Daniel patted his head, grateful for the familiar gesture, even as a million questions swirled in his mind. "But he's still safe, right? I mean, I've had him for months now, and he's never shown any signs of aggression." The vet nodded slowly. "As far as I can tell, he's not dangerous to you, at least not in the way we'd expect from a wild animal. But he's unpredictable. His behavior could change as he matures, especially since we don't fully understand what he is. And without that knowledge, we can't accurately predict his instincts or tendencies." Daniel looked down at Shadow, his heart sinking. Shadow stared back at him, his eyes as intense and mysterious as ever. Despite the vet's words, he couldn't see Shadow as anything other than the loyal companion he had raised from a shivering, abandoned puppy. Yet the vet's warning lingered, casting a shadow of doubt over his affection. "Daniel," the vet said gently, breaking his thoughts. "I understand that you care deeply about Shadow. But it's important to remember that he might have instincts we can't fully understand or control. He's still growing, and there's a chance he might become restless, even aggressive, if he feels confined." The words hit Daniel hard, filling him with an unexpected sense of loss. He had raised Shadow from the very beginning, nursing him back to health, bonding with him during quiet nights by the fire, watching him explore and play. The idea of letting him go, of acknowledging that Shadow might be a creature meant for the wild felt like a betrayal. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "So, what are you suggesting? That I let him go?" The vet's eyes softened, sympathy evident in her expression. "Not necessarily. But you should be prepared for the possibility that Shadow might need more space than you can give him. Some animals, especially those with wild instincts, need freedom. If you try to keep them contained, it can lead to behaviors that neither of you want to deal with." Daniel nodded, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. He looked down at Shadow, who was still watching him intently, as if he could sense every word they were discussing. "Thank you, Doctor," Daniel said quietly. I'll think about what you've said." The vet offered a gentle nod, her gaze lingering on Shadow one last time. "I know this is hard, Daniel. But remember, he'll always be a part of you, no matter where he is. Some bonds can't be broken by distance." Daniel offered her a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. He gathered Shadow's leash, and they left the clinic in silence. Outside, the air was crisp, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow over the parking lot. Shadow trotted beside him, his head held high, unaware of the decision Daniel now faced. Back at home, Daniel sat on the porch, Shadow curled up at his feet. He stared out at the woods beyond his cabin, his mind filled with memories of the months they'd spent together. He thought about the nights Shadow had curled up beside him, the quiet companionship they had shared, the strange but unbreakable bond that had grown between them. The vet's words echoed in his mind, some animals need freedom. The idea of releasing Shadow was painful, but he knew deep down that it might be the right thing to do. Shadow was unlike any creature he had known. He had a spirit that was wild, untamed, and Daniel feared that keeping him confined would only bring out the worst in him. Shadow lifted his head, his gaze meeting Daniel's. For a moment, they stared at each other in silence, an understanding passing between them. Shadow's eyes were calm, almost as if he understood what Daniel was contemplating. There was no fear in his gaze, only acceptance. The next morning, Daniel woke early, his mind made up. He packed a small bag, grabbing Shadow's favorite treats, a blanket, and a few other essentials. Shadow watched him curiously, his head tilted, as if sensing that something was different about today. They drove in silence to a remote clearing on the edge of a vast forest, one of the few places where Daniel felt Shadow could truly be free. When they arrived, Daniel opened the car door, and Shadow leapt out, sniffing the air eagerly. The trees stretched endlessly before them, the scent of the wild beckoning. Daniel knelt beside Shadow, his hand resting on his thick fur. "You know, you're more than just a pet to me," he murmured, his voice breaking slightly. "You're family. And if there's ever a way, I hope we'll meet again." Shadow looked up at him, a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling the ache of goodbye settle in his chest. He unclipped Shadow's leash, watching as the creature took a few tentative steps forward, then looked back one last time. "Go on, Shadow," Daniel whispered, his heart heavy. "This is where you belong." Shadow hesitated, his gaze lingering on Daniel for a long moment. Then, with a final, silent goodbye, he turned and disappeared into the forest, moving with the grace and purpose of a creature finally home. As Shadow's form vanished into the trees, Daniel felt both sadness and peace. He knew he had done the right thing, even if it meant letting go. Shadow's place was in the wild, where his instincts and nature could roam free. And as he turned to leave, he knew that the memory of Shadow would always stay with him, a reminder of the strange, beautiful bond they had shared. Back at home, Daniel sat alone with Shadow in the quiet cabin, the air thick with tension. Shadow had been pacing, its eyes flicking toward the door, as if sensing something beyond the walls that only it could understand. Daniel watched, his mind whirling with questions. After what the vet had told him, he felt torn. Shadow had become his companion, filling his days with purpose. But now, that purpose was muddled with worry, a nagging thought that maybe Shadow's true nature was meant to be somewhere else, somewhere wild. As the days passed, Shadow's behavior shifted. It grew restless, often scratching at the windows and doors, its eyes gleaming with an intensity Daniel hadn't seen before. On more than one occasion, Daniel would catch Shadow staring into the dense woods that surrounded his cabin, its body tense and alert, like it was waiting for something. One evening, Shadow leapt at the window, growling lowly, its gaze fixed on a distant point in the forest. Daniel's heart pounded as he watched, a strange fear gripping him. Shadow's wild instincts were coming alive, stronger than ever. "Shadow," Daniel murmured, trying to calm him. He reached out a hand, but Shadow's head whipped around, its eyes wild and unreadable. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. For a fleeting moment, Daniel felt like he was looking at an animal he didn't recognize, a creature born from nature's raw power. "Maybe you really aren't meant to be here," Daniel whispered, his voice filled with an ache he hadn't expected. One night, as they sat by the fire, Daniel found himself staring into Shadow's intense gaze, his own thoughts lost in the flames. He knew the vet's words were right. Shadow's behavior was a clear sign that he wasn't meant to live confined, even in the spacious area around Daniel's cabin. Shadow's restlessness had grown, its wild instincts becoming sharper, more pronounced with each passing day. Yet the idea of letting go gnawed at Daniel, the thought of losing the creature that had saved him from loneliness weighing heavily on him. Shadow's sharp ears perked up, its head tilting toward the window as if hearing something far away. It rose, padded toward the door, and sat, watching Daniel with an expectant look. The look was so familiar and yet so foreign. It was the same gaze Shadow had when it wanted to go outside, but this time it was different, deeper, filled with longing and an undeniable pull toward the wilderness. Daniel's heart sank, the realization hitting him hard. Shadow wanted to go beyond the cabin, beyond the small stretch of woods they often roamed together. The next morning, Daniel took Shadow for one last long walk through the woods, wanting to give him a taste of the freedom he clearly craved. Shadow moved through the trees with the grace of a wild creature, sniffing the air and listening intently to sounds Daniel couldn't hear. Every movement, every twitch of Shadow's body seemed to connect with the forest around him, as though it were speaking to him, calling him home. Daniel walked in silence, feeling both proud and heartbroken. The bond they'd shared was powerful, but he couldn't deny what he was seeing. Shadow belonged to the wild. As they neared the edge of the woods, Daniel crouched beside Shadow, running a hand through his thick, wild fur. "This might be goodbye, buddy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Shadow looked at him, its eyes calm but alert, as if it understood the weight of the moment. Daniel felt a lump in his throat as he watched Shadow take a few steps forward, then turn back to look at him one last time. Daniel's heart ached as he reached out to scratch behind Shadow's ears, feeling the warmth and strength of the creature he'd come to love like family. "Go on," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. Shadow took a few steps forward, pausing to glance back at Daniel, its gaze holding a quiet understanding that seemed almost human. Daniel knew that this was the right choice, even if it felt like losing a part of himself. Finally, with one last look, Shadow turned and trotted off into the woods, his movements smooth and confident, blending seamlessly into the wilderness. Daniel watched until Shadow disappeared, the reality settling heavily on his heart. He felt a profound loss, an emptiness that would take time to fill, but also a sense of peace. Shadow was where he belonged, free to roam, to follow the instincts that had been calling him all along. As Daniel made his way back to the cabin, he couldn't shake the feeling that Shadow would always be with him in some way, that the bond they'd shared had changed him forever. Shadow had taught him about loyalty, trust, and the deep connection between man and nature. And though he was gone, Daniel knew that Shadow's memory would stay with him, a reminder of the beauty and mystery of the wild. As Daniel trudged back to the cabin, each step felt heavier than the last. The silence around him seemed deeper, the absence of Shadow's quiet presence unmistakable. Shadows from the tall trees cast long stretches across his path, and he felt the weight of solitude in a way he hadn't since Shadow first came into his life. He remembered that cold, stormy night when he found Shadow, a tiny, abandoned puppy shivering on his porch, looking up at him with those strange, intelligent eyes. The cabin felt empty when he arrived, the quiet almost oppressive. His eyes lingered on Shadow's favorite spots, the corner of the kitchen floor where he'd lie down as Daniel cooked, the patch of sunlight near the door where he'd stretch out during lazy afternoons. Each memory hit like a wave, filling him with a mixture of pride and sorrow. As days passed, Daniel found himself slipping into old routines, but each day felt different, tinged with a quiet sadness. He would occasionally find himself outside, looking into the woods, half expecting to see Shadow's familiar silhouette emerging from the trees. But he knew that Shadow was likely far from here by now, deep into the wilderness where he truly belonged. One evening, about a week after he'd let Shadow go, Daniel heard a familiar rustling outside his cabin. His heart leapt as he raced to the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of his old friend. But the woods were still, the only movement coming from the wind rustling the leaves. With a sigh, he pulled himself away, reminding himself that he'd done what was best for Shadow, even if it left him with a lingering ache. Then, one misty morning, as Daniel was walking along the forest's edge, he spotted a set of paw prints leading toward the cabin. They were large, almost wolf-like, and unmistakably fresh. His heart raced as he followed the tracks, his mind racing with the possibility that Shadow had returned. He followed the tracks deeper into the woods, each step quickening with anticipation. As he rounded a tree, he saw a dark shape standing at a distance, watching him. It was Shadow, older, larger, and somehow even wilder, his form blending seamlessly with the forest around him. Shadow's eyes locked onto Daniel's, and in that instant, Daniel felt an unspoken understanding pass between them. Shadow didn't approach, but stood his ground, strong and proud, as if showing Daniel that he had become what he was meant to be. Daniel felt a wave of emotion, the sadness giving way to something more profound, a sense of closure, of peace. Shadow had found his place, and in some way, so had Daniel. With a slow nod, Daniel lifted his hand in a silent farewell. Shadow held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned and slipped back into the trees, disappearing as silently as he had come. Daniel stood there for a while, letting the moment settle, feeling the last remnants of sorrow lift, replaced by a quiet pride. He returned to his cabin with a lighter heart, knowing that he'd been given a rare gift, a connection to something wild, mysterious, and profoundly free. Shadow would always be a part of him, a reminder of the beauty in letting go, of the strength in respecting the call of the wild. Daniel gripped the steering wheel, his hands tense, his knuckles white as he drove along the winding road to the forest. Shadow sat beside him in the passenger seat, calm yet watchful, as if sensing the significance of their journey. The early morning air was crisp, and the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light over the trees and hills. Every now and then, Daniel glanced over at Shadow, taking in the creature's sharp, intelligent eyes and the strength in its lean, muscular body. He had grown accustomed to Shadow's presence, its quirks, and even its wild instincts, but today was different. For months, Shadow had been Daniel's companion, his loyal friend, and a source of both comfort and mystery. But now, knowing what he did, that Shadow wasn't a dog, but something untamable, part of a world beyond domestic life, Daniel knew he had to make a difficult choice. Letting go wasn't easy, but keeping Shadow confined to a cabin and a backyard felt wrong. Every time Shadow stared out the window or disappeared into the woods with unmatched agility, Daniel felt the pull of the wild growing stronger in his friend. As he pulled up to a clearing deep within the forest, Daniel's heart thudded with a mix of dread and determination. He stepped out of the truck, Shadow following closely behind, its ears perked up and nose twitching as it took in the scents of the woods. Daniel walked a few steps forward, stopping at the edge of the clearing, surrounded by towering trees and a soft carpet of fallen leaves. He knelt down, bringing himself level with Shadow, reaching out to scratch behind its ears one last time. "Shadow," he began, his voice thick with emotion. This is where you're meant to be, isn't it?" Shadow's intense gaze met his, and for a moment, Daniel felt as though the creature understood every word. Shadow moved closer, pressing its head against Daniel's chest, and for the first time, Daniel noticed a subtle tremor in the creature's frame, as if it too was aware of what was happening. He remembered the first day they had met, that rainy evening when Shadow had shown up on his porch, looking lost and frightened. Back then, Daniel had thought he was rescuing a helpless puppy. But now, he realized, Shadow had been more than capable all along. It was Daniel who had needed the companionship, the adventure, and perhaps even the lessons that came with raising an animal so different from what he had expected. "You're not like the others, are you?" he whispered, his hand resting on the creature's powerful shoulder. Shadow blinked, its gaze steady and unwavering. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him like a heavy blanket. "You belong out here," he continued, his voice cracking slightly. "Not with me. You need space, freedom, a place where you can truly be yourself." With a gentle nudge, he urged Shadow forward, motioning toward the open woods that lay beyond them. Shadow hesitated, looking back at Daniel one last time, its eyes soft with a mix of loyalty and longing. Daniel could feel his heart breaking, but he knew this was the right thing to do. It wasn't fair to keep Shadow confined to his world when it was clear that Shadow's spirit belonged somewhere far wilder, somewhere Daniel could never fully understand. "Go on," he whispered, the words barely escaping his throat. "Go live the life you're meant to have." Shadow's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before it turned and took a tentative step into the woods. Then another, and another, each one faster than the last, until it broke into a full run, disappearing into the thick foliage, its lean body moving with a grace that was both beautiful and heartbreaking to watch. Daniel stood there, his heart heavy, his chest aching as he watched Shadow disappear from sight. He stayed rooted to the spot, waiting, hoping for one last glimpse of his friend, but Shadow was gone, blending seamlessly into the forest, as though it had never belonged anywhere else. For a long time, Daniel stood there, alone in the clearing, his mind racing with memories of their time together, the nights by the fire, the hikes in the mountains, the quiet moments of companionship that had filled his days. As the minutes ticked by, a sense of peace washed over him, mingling with the sadness. He realized that Shadow had given him something priceless, a sense of purpose, a bond that transcended words or expectations. Their friendship had been unconventional, even wild, but it had changed him in ways he hadn't fully understood until now. When he finally turned to leave, Daniel's steps were slow, measured, and filled with a quiet resolve. He would carry Shadow's memory with him, a reminder of the extraordinary connection they had shared. And as he walked back to his truck, the morning light streaming through the trees, he felt a quiet assurance that somewhere, Shadow was free, living the life it was always meant to have. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell.